So far we just have some background music. I have this like little bell sound that I downloaded, and then I have a little edit of my me introing this piece of audio. So we can listen to that real quick. Oh, gotta rewind first. Welcome to my podcast thing about BMCC. Okay, so not the best edit, but you know, just doing a quick demo. Hopefully you guys will make something that sounds a little more natural. So let's add some effects and let's look at a little bit of what we can do with some of our audio. So one thing that you may want to do, and you know, we have the original audio files in here, so we can always go back and recover those. But one thing to note about Audacity that's different from a lot of other digital audio workstations like Logic or Pro Tools or Fruity Loops or other software that you guys may have used in the past is that when we do edits in Audacity, we're doing permanent edits to the audio. We're not like adding plugins that we can enable and disable. So it's a little bit limited in terms of how we can test things and how we can kind of layer things together. So we just have to be a little bit careful when we're doing that stuff. If you're working in Logic, you could add like a million plugins, and then if you don't like them, you can just turn them off. But in Audacity, every time we add an effect or do something to the sound, it's usually a permanent change. And so, of course, as I mentioned, we can go back and get the original audio, but we can't really undo the edits, especially if there's a few layers of undos that you can do, but you can't really see them very well. And so it's not as sophisticated as some of the other higher end production software. Obviously, it's a free program and it's geared towards very simple editing. So that is one of the limitations. That being said, let's look at some effects. So something that I'll often do is like basically like duplicate or make copies of a track so that if I screw something up, I can go back to it later. So I'll take this track with my voice. I'll make a new track here. So I'll go to tracks and say, let's add a new mono track, and I'll move this track up. Or maybe let's just make these guys smaller. And then what I could do is just copy this audio here and copy and paste it onto this track. Then I can just mute that track, and so I can hear the audio here. Welcome. And I can start to make some edits and do some stuff. And then if I screw something up, I can always go back to the track that I had before. So the mute button is really useful here. There's also a solo button. So if I click the solo button, I'll only hear the track that's soloed. So if I just want to hear my voice by itself, I can click solo. Welcome. So I hear my voice by itself. If I unclick that, then I'll hear these other background sounds. Let me turn it down just a little bit. Okay, so if we want to add some effects, so things we might want to do with the voice, I'm going to select this section and zoom in. Some things I might want to do with my voice is change some of the frequencies, change the pitch, do things like that. There's sort of like simple ways and more sophisticated ways of doing that depending on what you're going for. So an example that people will often do when they're first learning sound is take somebody's voice and make it sound like it's on a telephone. That doesn't really make sense in this context, but it's just a good example to use. So for example, if I wanted to make it sound like I was talking on a telephone, I would select this audio, and then I can go to effects. And this effects menu is where I'm going to find all of the different audio effects that I can apply here. And one of the things I can do is this EQ and filters. So there's some basic stuff like volume and compression. I can, make the track louder or quieter. Fade in, fade out. We looked at a very quick example of this last week. Pitch and tempo. I can change the pitch and speed of a track. We can try that maybe with another part in a second. But EQ and filters, this is where you're going to be doing some kind of like more sophisticated editing. So one thing that we could do is if we want to make a filter, there's two different types of filters. High pass filter is going to cut out lots of highs. Low pass filter is going to cut out some lows. If I want to make my voice sound like I'm talking on a telephone, the telephone has a restricted frequency range, so I could do something like a low pass filter. And so I could set the lowest frequency. If I set it to something like 1,000, we're going to cut out a lot of the lows, depending on where your voice is in the frequency range. and we can preview this. Welcome to my... So that sounds kind of the same. So let's turn this up a little bit. I'll go to 1200. Welcome to my... That still sounds kind of similar. Let's go up to like 1800. Welcome to my... Okay, that still sounds kind of the same. Let's try a larger roll-off. Okay, now we can start to hear I'm losing some of those low frequencies. So if I go up to like 2000, or maybe even, let's try 2000. Welcome to my... Do you see how you're starting to lose some of those low frequencies? We're just hearing the sort of like tinny higher frequencies. Let's go up to 10,000 and it's going to be really dramatic. Welcome to my... So we can change the quality of the voice. So low pass and high pass are for doing those specific things, but I can also go in and do something with like a filter curve or a graphic EQ. Graphic EQ is probably the easiest way to really visualize this whole thing. This shows me a wide range of frequencies starting at 20 and going all the way to 20K. So remember last week we talked about the range of human hearing goes from 20 hertz to 20K. And so all of the frequencies that we can hear are captured in here. And I can turn them down. If I turn all these down, we will hear certain parts taken out. So I'm just gonna set all of these to 0, and then we'll hear a few different frequencies. So again, this is something that takes a while to get used to. It's kind of fun to play around with. I don't know how useful it will be to you guys depending on what you're working on. Okay, so we've lowered everything. So now let's put in like a couple. I think my voice is like kind of in this range. So if I put these frequencies up, we should hear. So we can kind of hear a little bit of that, but not a whole lot. Whereas if I put like these lower frequencies up, I can just click in the middle to do this. So my voice probably doesn't really go that far below 100, but we can go from 100 down and see. So that's like nothing. What we're hearing is just the basic thing. Okay, so let's see that whole range. There we go. So now you can start to hear that a little bit. There's some presets over here. So I can do different presets here and kind of play around with those things. So if you have like too much high end, if you have too much low end, you can kind of cut those things out. If you want to emphasize a certain part of your voice, like a treble boost could emphasize the high end parts of the voice. Welcome to my... So that might sound a little bit clearer. The high end frequencies will tend to cut through the mix a little more rather than low end frequencies, which make things kind of like muddy and distorted a lot of the time. So you can play around with those depending on what you're going for. That may be useful. But if you want to do stuff that's like weirder and maybe a little more fun, oh, I forgot to, let's mute this again. We can do stuff with the pitch and tempo. So if I want to, change the pitch and tempo of my voice, I think that I can probably like reverse the voice somewhere if I want to do something goofy. Yeah, so I could reverse my voice. That could be something that's kind of fun to play with. I'm going to undo that. I could increase the pitch. So I could, the pitch is sort of like, this isn't like an instrument, so it doesn't necessarily make sense to think of it this way. We can think about it as a frequency, and we can make it higher or lower. So let's make it like 50% higher. See how that sounds? Welcome to my... So you can kind of get some funny effects that way, or we could lower it 50%. Again, you can kind of do some goofy stuff with that. You might enjoy that. We could add some reverb. Reverb is a really good way to make things sound better because it's sort of like reverb essentially is just adding an echo or delay, but it's a very, very short, small delay, so it kind of smooths things over. So if I add a nice reverb to my voice, it'll sound a little bit more smooth, and it'll sound more professional. That's also just because what we're used to listening to when you listen to music, especially, but podcasts and movies, people put a crazy amount of reverb on people's voices, especially for music production and stuff like that. Welcome to my. So that's like a very large room. We can do some different settings. Like I could do like I wanted like a really big thing, I would go with cathedral. You can't even hear my voice now because it's all reverb. If we wanted like, you know, the opposite of that, I could do like a bathroom. Welcome to my. So we get a lot of really sharp reverb there. You know, that's another effect that might be useful to add to make your voice sound a little smoother. If we listen to just the wet is the reverb part of the sound. So if we turn wet only, you can actually hear what's being created by this plugin. So it sounds kind of weird, but when it's mixed together with the rest of your voice, you get that effect. To my. So those are some effects that are kind of useful to make things sound kind of interesting or weird. One last effect that is a little bit harder to understand, but is really useful if you're doing an interview and there's a lot of noise, or if you're doing a podcast and there's a lot of noise in the background. You can do a where is it? Okay, so under noise removal and repair, there's a thing called a noise gate. And what this essentially does is it sets like a bottom amplitude or loudness, and anything that's below that loudness, it just removes completely. And so this is a great way to get rid of like background noise or sound in between when you're speaking that you might not want. So let's actually choose, I'm gonna go to this clip because there's some more breaks in here. Podcast thing about the podcast thing about. So we can't really hear this noise because I have background music. So let's solo this for a second, and I apologize, but I'm going to turn it up a little bit louder, and we're going to try to hear this noise here. Thing about thing. So this is actually mostly just my voice. Thing. But let's say we wanted to cut it out. I would select this section. And I'm probably going to have to do this in a more exaggerated way than what you would really want to do to show this effect. But what I'm going to do is go to Effect and go to Noise Removal and Repair, go to Noise Gate. And so there's a few settings here. This gate threshold is basically what's the cutoff. So any sound below this amount is going to get cut off. -40 may seem a little counterintuitive, but when we measure the loudness of sound, 0 is actually the loudest a sound can be. 0 is like the original recorded loudness of a sound, and we go negative to get quieter and quieter. And so like -infinity is like the quietest a sound can be. Sort of weird. We don't really have to go into all the physics for that, but that's just what you need to know to understand these numbers. If we set this at -40, it's probably not going to do anything. Podcast. I'm actually going to go ahead and apply, and we'll see. So it doesn't really do anything at that because everything in this track is pretty loud. But let's say I do something much more dramatic, like -10, and apply. See how it cut out those sections of noise? So now I just have the louder portions of this clip. Podcast. And so if you have a lot of background noise, if you have like weird clicks and stuff going on in your recording, a noise gate is a really good way to just quickly remove anything that doesn't meet a certain loudness. You have to play around with it a little bit because you might cut out certain parts of your recording that you want. But it's a really, really useful plugin for anything that involves people speaking, anytime you record something on your own and you want to remove stuff from the background. So that's in the effect, noise removal, noise gate. There's some other stuff in here that's also useful, but that's the one that I use the most. Let's see, are there any other? There's some like, you know, Audacity isn't really for music production, so this isn't the kind of stuff that you would want to add typically on a podcast or something like that. But let's imagine, let's say we wanted to like turn our background track. So I'm gonna solo the background music for a second, and so we have this kind of like bouncy, waltzy Christmas music kind of vibe going on. So let's say we wanted to make it like a little more, I don't know, like punk or something like that. I could select this track. So I'm just going to double click on this, and I could go to Effect, and let's add some distortion. This is probably going to sound awful because it's not really what we're supposed to be using this for, but let's just see as an example. I'm going to choose a setting like hard overdrive. See what that sounds like. What? Yeah. So yeah, maybe if that could be useful if you're doing like a horror story or something like that. You could add some distortion, or you could do some different effects with your background music, or sound effects, or other things like that. So I think those are our basic effects. You can download effects and add them in here, like any effect or plugin that you might have on Logic or Pro Tools. A lot of the time it would also work in Audacity, but Audacity again is really just a simple basic program that's just meant for usually just editing like a simple podcast or something like that. So let's see, is there anything else we want to look at? There's other stuff. I mean, all of these effects are really useful in different ways, but of course we don't have time to cover everything. So I think that's a good example of just a few effects. You can go in and kind of play with those and maybe explore some other ones to get a little bit more out of the audio that you've recorded or that you're using. So I'll stop there so we have some time to work in class. Later in class, I'll go over how to export our finished file and publish it. But for now, let's stop here and we'll move to workshop time.